Wizards of the Coast has released the single worst banned and restricted announcement I've ever seen earlier this morning. And I've been through a lot as a Modern player. And we're going to talk about this with timestamps down below, primarily in the lens of Modern, but we will touch on briefly with Legacy and the lack thereof of Pioneer. So buckle up, let's head right into it, and I'll try and not make this video super long. Now with Modern, we have Preordain being unbanned and Legacy, Mind's Desire being unbanned. A lot of discussion below, and I will link the article for specifics in case you want to read through it. But with Modern, we have Preordain being unbanned. And before we hop into that, I want to talk about what is not banned. The Modern metagame in many ways is in an absolute mess. We have Rakdos mid-range all over the format at almost 20%, 18.3% of the metagame, and almost at under half that is the next big deck at 4 to 5 color Omnath, Burn, Tron, Crashing Footfalls, blah blah. Everything else is in some form of the tier 1.5 is in some form of a 4%, whereas the tier 1 is largely at 7 to 9, and then Rakdos mid-range may not necessarily in some people's opinions be tier 0, but that metagame representation puts it at almost at tier 0, considering the playership bias of it winning a PT recently. It's doing a lot. Now, one of the cards that a lot of people wanted banned is the One Ring, and this one I'm less so upset about, and I will say this because I personally accepted the fact that Wizards won't be banning this, considering they are re-releasing the Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth set later this year. They'll be presenting some mechanically unique cards later on in that re-release as well, and the One Ring will of course be in that set. So I don't think removing the marquee card, especially after Post Malone just bought it for 2.6 million Canadian dollars, I don't think banning this card would have been great PR. So I've accepted that it was not going anywhere. But we also are not losing, I should say, Grief. One of the marquee cards of the Rakdos scam deck, and probably the whole reason why it's called scam, because of the things that you're doing to your opponent by reanimating Grief. It's absolutely insane that this type of play pattern has to continue. Many of you as two viewers already know I hate having Thoughtseize cast against me, although I do understand why it needs to be in the format. But now Thoughtseize being on a 4/3 body, and I say 4/3 because once it's reanimated, it'll have +1/+1 with those black reanimation spells. With Menace attacking me, I've lost my 2 best cards, and I have a 4/3 attacking me, and if I don't lose a permanent, I can't even fatal push it. And sure, it's boltable, and sure, it's, you know, you can solitude it as well, but you're losing your 2 best cards. The fact that you likely don't have Bolt after that, you don't have something to pitch to Solitude, if Solitude at all, you don't have an answer to most of these situations. And so Grief was untouched. None of the elementals were touched at all. And the Rakdos scam deck is allowed to scam the rest of the Modern metagame, which is extremely frustrating. You now have to play decks like Tron that are notably, you know, placed second place and did really well at the PT, because Tron doesn't necessarily care about Thoughtseize. It's able to circumvent that and top deck really well past your hand disruption and create these giant explosive plays that Grief can't necessarily beat. It's got you in the early game, but once you start playing Karn and Staring Bridge and the One Ring, it starts to lose some of its value. So if you're forced into playing decks like that, well, why don't we play something like Fury a little bit more aggressive? And even Fury wasn't touched, which also frustrates me, because cards like this are limiting the creativity of the Modern format, where you don't have creature-based strategies that are able to thrive and do well. Even with Solitude is just one creature, whereas Fury is able to hit multiple X1s, multiple X2s, maybe, you know, an X3 and an X1, or just whatever, some big creature come down and be a double striking threat. This is also one of the marquee cards that Rakdos Scam is able to scam out in front of you. Double strike is a mean thing when you're doing 6 damage and having first strike against certain creatures. You know, double strike does a lot, right? And then finally, the last card that I really want to talk about is Violent Outburst. None of the Cascade decks were touched at all, and not necessarily that they should have been, but this is just going along the pattern of nothing in Modern was changed whatsoever. And that is my ultimate problem, that I think this Modern metagame is going to get real toxic real fast, and there's a lot of problems that are coming down the line for it. With Cascade running amok, we're going to have the continuance of playing Endurance, so that's going to be in every green capable sideboard out there to stop the Living End decks. Living End decks are going to be constantly competing with the Rhinos decks at an arms race of who's the better Cascade deck. I think Living End is technically in terms of that race, but both decks present a very strong strategy that are now going to stick along forever. And you know what? This deck is fine, but if nothing's going to change in Modern, it's just going to be Scam beating this deck out. Because ultimately, yes, they can top deck the Violent Outburst and they can keep going, but do we have to keep playing dead strategies like this, or brain dead strategies, I should say, like this, to constantly beat our Rakdos Scam Thoughtseize opponents, it'd be nice to try something different and not have a deck take over 18%, almost 20%, almost 1/5 of the modern metagame and have no reasonable answer to it. Look at this damn modern metagame. I've gone silent because I don't know what else to say. It's absolutely ridiculous. Orcish Bowmaster's fine. It's coming in and it's stopping Ragavan. The One Ring is accessible to all decks, but it's expensive as all hell. God knows how Card Hoarder is dealing with this right now, because everyone is probably renting the living bejesus out of that card right now, because it's probably good in every single modern deck right now. But we also have to have a discussion about what was unbanned. Kind of shift our lens here. Let's talk about what we're going to do now that Preordain is unbanned in modern. It's been a really long time. People thought that giving blue decks more, better card selection was just not a good idea. And Preordain is very comparable to some of the things that already exist in the modern format, but we need to understand its structure first. So it's 1 blue for a sorcery where you scry 2, then draw a card. Very similar templating to a card we're going to talk about in a second, but the differences are notable. So in this case, you scry 2 first, then draw cards. So you get to look at the top 2 cards of your library, decide what you want immediately, then draw the card. If you want one of them, you put it on top. If you don't want either, if you want one of them, not the other, you put one on the bottom. If you don't want either of them, you put them away and then you draw a card. So you have the potential to look at the top 3 cards of your library and make a relatively, and you don't get to make that decision on the third one, but you get to make a relatively informed decision about those top 3 cards as to what you want in that situation. The most comparable example to this is Serum Visions, where in this case you get to draw a card, then scry 2, so it's delayed gratification. So you get to replace Serum Visions. It's raw card draw, it's a little bit of power, and you get some setup later on. Now, Serum Visions has that delayed gratification where you have the potential to go 4 cards deep. You replace with the top card, you scry 2, maybe you don't want those 2 cards, you put at the bottom, you then draw a raw card. So there are upsides and downsides, but generally speaking, Preordain is the better card because you get to see what you need immediately. The modern format is not a slow format, although they've tried to slow it down. You need cards now. You need your selection now. So ultimately, I think that Preordain is going to have a really big effect on the modern format, but not format warping necessarily. It's going to be a great addition to the blue decks that want it, and just having one CMC off is going to be big. I think especially in decks like Murktide Regent, we might see Expressive Iteration actually get replaced by Preordain, or at least played alongside, where some copies of Expressive are replaced. Expressive has a good power to it where you're able to exile something, play it immediately, put something in your hand, and feed your graveyard a little bit with it. So with the 2 cards you cast and everything, but being 1 less mana is huge. Being half the cost is massive in a deck that's tempo based, wants to make efficient mana plays, especially take advantage of early Ragavan treasures. Preordain is going to be insane if you get an attack trigger in, you then have counterspell and a Preordain up on your next turn. It's really good. It's a lot better than a lot of people are giving it power to. Now, in terms of what are the decks that this card is going to go into, it's pretty obvious that it's going to be most of the blue strategies. It might just be the Dimir control deck that's been running around recently, so the One Ring not being banned alongside Orcish Bowmasters. We're going to see this deck be hyper powered up with something like Preordain, where you're going to get increased card selection. We already have things like Lorien Revealed and Archmage's Charm available for a little bit of advantage. We have that late game draw. Archmage's Charm gives you that versatility of stealing things, but also regularly being card draw outside of counter spelling. But just being blue, it pitches to force and negation, it pitches to subtlety, and subtlety is going to see huge strides upward, considering the fact that, well, Grief and Scam and Fury in general are going to be running around hitting you on turn 1. You need something like Subtlety. Spell Pierce is going to start seeing some points down, because ultimately you may counter the reanimation spell, but chances are they're going to grief you. You're not going to have that counter spell, and then they're going to grief you again. They're going to then take the removal spell or your next best spell or your turn 1 play, whatever it might be. So you need the Subtlety immediately. Preordain feeds into that while also giving you a little bit of selection if you manage to keep it. Now, the next type of deck that I've already mentioned is going to be Murktide Regent, Expressive Iteration, potentially being shaved or played alongside a Preordain. This deck is going to love selection all the time. If you don't want your lightning bolts, you need creatures, you play that. You don't need your counterspell because your board's good enough. You maybe need an unholy heat to clear their board. Great, you select some cards away, put them to the bottom, and you're golden all the way through. You're definitely going to want to potentially even just replace Considers altogether. Now Considers have that added potential and benefit of feeding Murktide Regent and Dragon's Race Channeler with the Surveil ability, so maybe not. There is a potential it doesn't get replaced, but I think the selection could just be more biased for this deck. This deck may not want to aggro out Murktide Regents, but instead find counterspells, find unholy heats, find spell snares, spell pierces, whatever it might be. So I think the Consider might actually get replaced by that alongside Expressive Iteration, if both at all. The final deck would probably be temple-based strategy, similar to that, something like Grixis Death Shadow. So you got the control decks, you got the big tempo decks, and you got some blue-based creature strategies. Heck, Merfolk might even want Preordain as well. Likely not. They all have their own kind of card draw, but I'm just mentioning them out there that these blue-based strategies are going to love a card like this. They're already playing bad cards like Sauron's Ransom. They're playing Orcish Bowmasters. They're playing Expressive Iteration. So Expressive Iteration might actually largely be replaced here because having lower cost card selection is absolutely insane. I really feel like this deck would rather be casting Preordain outside of Expressive Iteration for one less. You're then going to be able to hold up Thought Seizes, Spell Pierces, more mana for Ragavan, Death Shadow, Bolt, everything. Being mana efficient in a deck like this is extremely important. Being half the cost of Expressive Iteration likely makes a good case for it to be completely replaced in a deck like this. So Preordain, I think, is going to make a very long-lasting effect in Modern. Won't be meta warping. I think we have a lot more problems to deal with in current Modern. Next up, I want to touch on some of the other formats really briefly in Legacy. So Legacy, first of all, we have Mind's Desire. That is the card being unbanned. No other changes to the format. Notably, it is restricted in Vintage. So we can see that if a card like this is restricted in Vintage, we get a hint of the power level that it could pose in the Legacy format. You shuffle your library, then exile the top card of your library until the end of turn. You may play that card without paying its mana cost. So you get free cards off the top with Storm. Now, notably, it does have 6 mana, but there are many ways to generate high mana costs or high mana pools in Storm decks. You're already casting stuff like Tendrils of Agony. That's a 4 mana Storm card. So I don't think getting 2 more mana is necessarily going to be that much of a problem. With that Storm count, you're exiling more cards off the top of your library. You're casting them for free. So you can Mind's Desire into a Tendrils, into more card draw, into more mana, into just more and more and more. Mind's Desire is a win condition based in itself. You don't need to necessarily find your other win conditions. You just storm out into Mind's Desire, which could go into more Mind's Desires, which could go into cards that shuffle your graveyard back into your library and just goes into more and more and more. It's a very almost near determinate win to get something like this. So whether or not this breaks the Legacy format, it's not up to me. I don't play that format very much at all, but I am aware of it. And the one thing I will say largely is Flusterstorm is about to see some huge points up in the Legacy format. So maybe get your copies while you still have them. If you're playing this in paper, be ready for rental services to maybe require a little bit more for a card like Flusterstorm. Just be aware of it. It's going to be a pretty damn good card in Legacy coming up. Now, Pioneer is the last format that I want to touch on. Again, another format that I'm very adjacent to, I'm very aware of, and a format that I always try to get into, especially now that they've announced at Gen Con that likely next year we're going to have a playable Pioneer format on the Arena client. I'm definitely, according to that and some other reasons, of things that they've announced for Arena, I'm looking to definitely get back into the Arena for client. Pioneer is one of them, so I do want to touch on this as someone slightly aware of the fact that the Pioneer metagame is pretty limited by some of the top decks in the format. Now, this metagame description or kind of diversity that you see isn't really painting the best picture. You're seeing, 2 decks relatively at the top: Nykthos Ramp, Rakdos Sack. You see spirits, humans, mid-range, control. Like, you see a little bit of everything, some combos, some creatures, some big mana. The problem is that this diversity doesn't really share what's actually happening. A lot of folks that play Pioneer will cite the fact that, unfortunately, the big ramp deck, the big deck in the format, Nykthos Ramp, is holding a lot of the format back because of the pure power level of the deck, of what it can do. And with Nykthos, you're creating giant pools of mana and then playing into Karn the Great Creator, tutoring out of your sideboard, creating infinite loops with other walkers. There's so many things happening in this deck. There's so much power that this deck has in the Pioneer format. I think no changes to Pioneer is going to see big shrinkage in the playability of the format, and we're going to see potentially, if this continues, levels of playability that we saw after, you know, months of no bans from some old combo decks that held the Pioneer format prison a couple of years back. Right when people were out there playing it, we had Thassa's Oracles all over the place, Jace, Wielder Mysteries, not Wielder Mysteries, sorry, I'm thinking of the wrong Jace, but Jace and Thassa's Oracle on the battlefield with Inverter, just ruining the format, and WotC just citing that, hey, there are answers to it. It doesn't have a crazy big win percentage. Unfortunately, it was all over the leagues, so the numbers don't exactly mean anything if you're looking at the numbers and manipulating them for your own results. So I think the Pioneer format is going to suffer a lot here, but largely we're back to the announcement here. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. My personal take, again, this is probably one of the worst announcements ever. We definitely needed some shakeups in the modern format. I am happy that something was unbanned. It's something that I'm very much an advocate of. If you've seen some of my shorts as well, I'm very much an advocate for unbanning cards to increase power level. I think Preordain is a great addition to the modern format. It should have been added a while ago, to be honest, especially with Modern Horizons 3 around the corner next summer, and probably just rotating the modern format again. I think Preordain is perfectly fine, but we could have seen some other unbans potentially to shake things up more, or we could have just seen some bans to really change the way this metagame thinks. But we'll see. Let's let Preordain breathe. Let's see if it can affect the Rakdos scam metagame and maybe just bring the blue decks up more, help those control decks, those mid-range decks, so that the combo decks and the scam decks don't see as much light in the day. Let me know what you think of the ban list and the ban announcement down below. Let me know what you think should come off, what should get banned. Love to hear from you.